Hello, my name is Nicole van Bruggen, and as the co-artistic director of the Australian Romantic and Classical Orchestra, I would like to welcome you to our first Voyage of Musical Discovery for 2021. We're going to explore motivic development in the Serenade on Swedish Melodies by Max Bruch and in the Suite for Saxophones and Loop Station by Nick Russoniello. The first half of this program is being performed on romantic period string instruments by the Australian Romantic and Classical Orchestra, directed by my co-artistic director, Rachael Beesley. We will guide you through Bruch's Serenade and look at his compositional methods and investigate how he uses motifs to create this work. Following this, Nick will demonstrate and explain how he develops motifs in his own compositions. So, during this voyage, we're talking about motivic development. First and foremost then, what is a motif? A motif is the smallest, self-contained musical compositional idea. Let's call it the musical atom. It's shorter than a phrase, it's shorter than a theme, and it can be melodic or rhythmic or harmonic or a combination of these three elements. A motif then recurs and is developed by the composer through a section or through an entire work. Motifs can also be found outside of music. So have a look around you now and see what kind of repetitive patterns you can see. If you're wearing a school uniform, you might see a repetitive pattern in the skirt fabric perhaps. These kinds of things are motifs to look for outside of music. There are also motifs in architecture, for example. So what can you see here in the City Recital Hall if you look around for repeating patterns? I had a look earlier and I noticed we have these vertical panels behind the stage with the horizontal lines, which is then carried up behind on the balcony to that stage. And those horizontal lines also come back in the columns, for example, on both sides, obviously. So that's the kind of thing that an architecture would use to develop a motif. A motif can also be a dominant or a recurring idea in a film or a book. So next time you're reading or at the cinema, be aware of the motifs which the author or the director are using to create unity within them. There's an example of this, for example, in Romeo and Juliet, where Shakespeare uses a rose as a recurring motif through the play, as a symbolism of the theme of love. So, can you think of musical motifs? I'm sure you can. I think the orchestra might have one to get us started. We all recognise that one. That's actually one motif played twice. And in fact, that's not technically a motif. That is actually what we call a leitmotif, which is spelled L-E-I-T-M-O-T-I-F, which is German for a leading or a guiding motif. So I can hear you thinking straight away, what is the difference, Nicole, between a motif and a leitmotif? Well, I'll tell you. A leitmotif is slightly longer than a motif. It's more like a theme, and it represents a particular character or an object or a place or an idea. This one was obviously used by John Williams in the Star Wars trilogy, and it represented Darth Vader and the dark side. John Williams actually used 55 leitmotifs in the Star Wars score. So you won't hear leitmotifs being developed in, say, music from the Marvel superheroes movies or the background music for MasterChef or something like that. The role of music in those places is just to reinforce what you already see. It doesn't hint at any extra meaning like a leitmotif. Can anyone think in the hall of any other examples of leitmotifs from films? Can you give me any ideas? Yes? Jaws. That was on the top of my list. Good one. Jaws is a very well-known one, of course. We're still scared when we go in the water if someone sings that motif. Any other ideas of leitmotifs from films? Have you seen the Harry Potter films? So we recognise through the Harry Potter films Hedwig's theme. That comes back through the various themes, and it changes every time her character is developing. So these are examples of leitmotifs. The other one that I had on my list was James Bond. So we all recognise the various leitmotifs in the music for James Bond. There was one classical music composer who was really well known for his use of leitmotif. Does anyone know who that composer is? Any ideas? I think I heard it. Wagner, exactly. Richard Wagner. So he wrote a very famous work called Der Ring des Nibelungen, which we call the Ring Cycle in English, and he actually uses 90 leitmotifs through that work. And he himself, he considered a leitmotif to be the beginning of modern music, and that was in 1857, way before films came in. So in music, motifs are repeat, but the most important thing that they do, like a good story, they develop. Think about how we become interested in a story once the central ideas start to develop and grow. It's the same with music. By understanding the ways that motifs are altered, fragmented, extended, transposed, disguised, and otherwise developed throughout a work, gives an insight into the inventiveness and the skill of a composer. Longer themes and entire pieces are constructed by repeating and modifying and connecting little motifs. We recognize gradual alterations in the melody, the rhythm, and the harmony of a work as variations just on that original motif. So if you incorporate these gradual changes when you're composing your own music, it will create unity and homogeneity. It's satisfying for us as the listener and also as the player when things belong together and are related. Now, back to Bruch. We're going to take a look at the melodic motifs in the first movement of his Serenade, which the orchestra performed to open this evening's voyage. The first movement of Bruch's Serenade is loosely based on a march written for the coronation of Karl XII of Sweden at the turn of the 19th century. He became king at the age of only 15, and he was an extremely aggressive military leader. That aside, it's an excellent example of how a short piece can be constructed by means of motivic development. Brooke was smart to base his music on a simple folk melody. He spent much of his life collecting and developing melodies from folk music, particularly from Russia and from Sweden. Folk music is a great place for you to source your motifs if you'd like to borrow something to get started. Julia Russoniello, up the back there of our orchestra, whose husband is going to join us in the second half of this voyage, has an example now of a simple folk melody to give us some inspiration. So if you did recognise that Irish folk tune, it's because the Corrs used it for one of their pop songs way back, about 1999 or something, we were thinking. The simplicity of folk music source material makes it easy to hear what Bruch does with his motives. The first movement is compositionally more intricate than the sort of military march it was based on. And with it lasting a little more than 2 minutes, we don't hear any elaborate sweeping development sections or dramatic key changes or other sorts of shifts, which you'd be used to from music from this period. It's possible to imagine that this entire little march has expanded outwards from a single initiating 2-bar idea, like a single cell gradually multiplying to form an entire organism. Okay, so let's hear this motive. It starts pianissimo, as you know, very softly in this low register. That's it. That's the motive. A couple of bars later, Bruch adds a basic harmonization in all the parts, but still softly. He then uses call and response method, officially called antiphony, to respond to this opening motive. The answering motive in the following bar is almost the same. Brooke just changes a couple of notes, and that subtle switch is all that he needs. Now that Brooke's introduced this melodic motive and already added a slight modification, he reinforces it a few bars later with the same harmonies, but this time fully voiced and marked forte or loud. Let's listen to the motive in both call and response. Now we are fully acquainted with Brooke's core idea, his march motive for this movement. Now's the time for a more elaborate variation. Notice now how he uses a dotted rhythm in this next modification to let us know that this has sprouted from the initial motive. And now let's hear that more elaborate version of the motive again, with both the violin parts playing in harmony, sharing the same rhythm. To accompany this new elaborate version, Brooke writes an arpeggiated bass line, just spelling out the new chord progression in E flat major. After they've played this section, can someone tell me from the audience what string technique is being used here, and preferably someone who's not a string player? I can tell by all the coming from the audience that we know the word. So what's that string technique called? Pizzicato, that's right. Pizzicato. There must be many string players in the audience. Pizzicato is when the string players pluck the string instead of bowing. Okay, so now let's hear all of those elements put together. Only a couple of bars later, Brooke splits the first and second violins from 2 parts into 4. When a composer splits one orchestral section into 2 or 2 into 4, as in this case, they're expanding the possibilities of the orchestration. This is called divisi, a technique which Brooke makes great use of in this work. So what is the opposite, can you tell me, of pizzicato? Oh, happens to be the name of a great orchestra I know. The lower strings revert to arco in the accompaniment. This makes the texture thicker, and even though the dynamic is still marked piano. So, as you may have noticed so far, the techniques to develop your motive, they don't have to be complicated. There's a myriad of ways to choose simple modifications and to use them to great effect. To bring a close to this first movement, Brooke now does something quite remarkable. He breaks the motive down and he fades it out. This is motivic development at its best. All of these examples, which you've just heard, form almost the entire movement. Listen out for them now. We're going to put them all back together for you again. Thanks, Rachael. even though we presented that motive as an example of a melodic motive, of course, it also had rhythmic and harmonic features, and Brooke used those as well in its development. It was fragmented, extended, transposed, and it was disguised with different instruments and different playing techniques, as well as dynamics, tempo, and so on. This is normal in music. The musical parameters interact and cooperate and result in the music changing or developing over its duration. Like the scriptwriters of a good Netflix series, we keep watching or listening or even binging because we want to know what's going to happen next. So once you have your motive, we also encourage you to sing it and to play it, improvise around it. Don't be afraid to muck around with the melody and the rhythm and the harmony. That's how you'll create your new ideas, which will then relate back to your original motive. So we're going to jump now to the fourth movement, which features a motive that is, of course, melodic and rhythmic, but you could say that the harmonic qualities of this motive stand out in particular. It's a beautiful chord progression which oscillates between major and minor with very close voicings. Have a listen to the initial opening phrase to become acquainted with the harmonic motive. How did you go? You might find that the harmonic motives are a little trickier to identify. These are some really rather luscious harmonies there, and that makes sense when you think that it's a love song from a Swedish folk music. So let's pull it apart now to see if we can find these harmonic motives more easily. We'll start by listening to the descending bass line at the beginning. Beautiful. Now that you've heard that by itself, just concentrate on only the bass line as we add the other parts. Listen to how the harmonies burst out of that lower part. A few bars later, Bruch spells out the harmonic richness even more by using divisi again. This time he divides both the viola and the cello sections from 2 parts into 4. So the mid to lower strings, we now have 2 viola parts, 2 cello parts, and a double bass line. You can now hear even more clearly how this divisi technique thickens the orchestral texture. This phrase is still closely related to the opening of the movement. It's just transposed up an octave and the dynamic level is increased. So again, keep your attention on that descending bass line in the second cellos and the double basses, while the first cellos have a pizzicato arpeggiation of the harmony. Let's see how those lower strings can divide and conquer. And now the divisi violas can have a go. The first violas are playing the melody only for the first 3 beats before crescendoing into those all-important inner harmonies. And of course, the first and second violins are traditionally always in divisi. In this phrase, the second violins outline and fill in the chordal detail with an undulating sextuplet rhythm, which means 6 notes within one beat. So now that we've broken it all down, let's listen to it back together again now. First and second violins, first and second violas, first and second cellos, and the double bass. Brooke then develops this harmonic motive by transposing it just into the key of subdominant key of A flat major. And he soon decides that that original descending bass line is so good that he lets everyone except the first violins have a crack at developing the line and the rhythmic motive into something more harmonically luscious. On top of this richness, he adds a swirling melodic line in the first violins. So now that you can recognise the harmonies built upon that descending bass line, let's see if you can hear the harmonic motive come in and out of focus as the orchestra plays the whole movement for you. So we have one more final motif to demonstrate for you. It's a rhythmic motif from the third movement. Here it is. So that rhythm was based on a Dalekarlian dance rhythm from Swedish folk music. As you can hear, it's a very simple idea. Listen out for it when you hear the whole work in a moment, and pay attention to how that gallopy little rhythm, or bits of it, pop up in almost every bar of the third movement. This is motivic development, and Brooke does it extremely well. We've jumped around a bit now within Brooke's Serenade to discuss various ways he uses motivic development. The orchestra is going to perform the entire work for you now. You'll hear similar features to the ones we've already discussed in the second movement, with motifs being passed between sections of the orchestra. As we round off this first half of the voyage, I have one final bit of pretty cool motivic development that happens on a larger scale within this work. After that fourth movement with all the luscious harmonies which you've just heard, what does Brooke do next? He repeats the first movement, the march, almost identically. This form harks back to an earlier idea of a processional followed by the recessional, coming in, sitting and listening, and then leaving again. And the idea is that by the time you leave, you're all a little bit smarter. In this first half of the voyage, then, we've looked at three concepts of developing motifs. This happens simultaneously in music, but it's useful for you as a composer to recognise these ideas. First look at the rhythm, then look at the melody, and then the harmony within. It's important to understand each concept separately and know how to apply them, but ultimately, you'll of course be combining all three aspects to create your music. Our orchestra's founding artistic director and renowned conductor and music educator, the late Richard Gill, wrote that it is through the variation of the three fundamental elements of music that interest is drawn and maintained. He encouraged people to experiment, and he often said, if you don't do that, how will you ever know? It's important to remember that Brooke created that Serenade in 1916. Just think for a minute, what else was happening in the world around that time? We've got Picasso and Cubism, Freud and dreams, Dixieland, Karl Marx, Gallipoli, Charlie Chaplin. Against all of that, we might say that this music was perhaps a little conservative, but the principles of motivic development, they started much earlier than that, and they've continued throughout the 20th century and will do beyond. 21st and beyond, I should say.
One of the most important things out of all of this, and especially in the past 25 years, is the question of style and genre. As a specialist in historically informed performance, I'm curious and passionate about searching through all resources to discover more about history and the history of music. From primary and secondary sources such as books, recordings, contemporary criticisms and reviews. I'm fascinated by repertoire from all periods and styles, and I'm sure you've all read one of those music history books where each period and style is dealt with in a different chapter. You know, Baroque, classical, romantic, serial, jazz, pop, folk, global, electronic and experimental. But in reality, it's more complicated than that. For example, we as classical musicians also improvise. But improvisation today means more than just writing your own cadenza. It can indicate a multitude of small or large musical decisions that are made spontaneously. Repeating and modifying existing sounds and motifs are common features across all styles, as well as acting and reacting to the actions of the players around you. As you have just heard, we as classical musicians also include folk or world music as part of our repertoire, while jazz and pop and folk musicians also create film scores, and they merge these styles together. So you, as a young composer, can also utilise the latest technology, using recording apps on your phones, and also experimenting and creating your own new style of music. This is really an accurate mirror of our contemporary daily life. News, social media, all the conversations that you're having, the clothes you're wearing, the cultures, the language, these are all coexisting and constantly updating.
So, without further ado, I would like you to join me in welcoming Nick for the rest of the Voyage of Musical Discovery.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here tonight. So my name is Russoniello, and tonight I'm going to be taking you through my suite for saxophone and loop stations. So that was movement 1, which I call B-popped loops. So when I'm writing music, I like to keep in mind a very, very simple idea, and I think it's an idea that can really help you guys when you write your own music. And that idea is that from little things, big things grow. For me, that's what MOTIVIC development is all about, taking a very, very small idea and making a big piece from that idea. So I want to show you how I do that in my suite for saxophone and loop stations. But before I do that, you're probably wondering what all this gear is down here. So I kind of want to show you what this is first. So this is my loop station. And basically a loop station is 3 loop pedals strapped together. And a loop pedal, they've been around for a long time, since like the 60s. And composers like Steve Reich and Lamont Young, they use them in a genre that we now call minimalism. So there was a genre in like the 60s of very, very repetitive music. So music that would just repeat sometimes for hours with very few changes, quite hypnotic kind of music. So the loop station was really, really useful for that kind of music because basically what it does, right, is I record my musical motif into the station. Hello, 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 hello. And it will repeat it forever. Hello, forever, hello, and ever. Hello. So I can then record other things in. So, hello, what, 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 hello,
is it me you're looking for?
What, hello, what, hello, what, hello, what, hello, what, hello, what, hello. You get the idea? And using that technique, I can build up different textures to my piece. So I can have one idea running at a time, which you might call a monophonic texture. So one idea, what. Or I can have 2 ideas running at the same time, so like a biphonic texture. Hello, what? Or the whole thing, all 3 musical ideas, 3 musical motifs at the same time, which we would call polyphony or polyphonic texture. Hello, what? Right? So that's the general idea at play in all of these pieces. So that piece that you just heard, B-pop loop, basically started with just 2 small ideas. So I want to show you those ideas and what I kind of did with them. The very first idea that I had when I was writing this piece was that drumming sound that you heard at the beginning, where I kind of blow across the top of my saxophone, this thing. So I'm just blowing across the top of the sax with no mouthpiece. I'm like, that's a cool idea, I want to use that to make a piece. So I had that one idea, and then I had the other idea, which I call the bebop idea, which is this one, sounds like this. You know that one? So I had 2 ideas, but that doesn't make a piece. So I'm like, what can I do to turn those 2 ideas into a piece? So I did what everyone should do, and I tried a whole bunch of different things. The first thing I remember doing is I tried playing my bebop idea, that twisty, windy one that reminded me of the jazz greats like Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie. That windy one, I tried playing it backwards. So it sounded something like this. And I'm like, ooh, this is kind of cool, but it's really hard to play. So I put that on the shelf, didn't want to use that. Then I decided I would transpose that idea, which means I'm going to play the exact same idea, right, but starting on a different pitch. So I'm going to, instead of starting it up here, I'm going to start it down here, a minor third lower. And if you put music a minor third apart, it kind of sounds sad, right? So a minor third, 3 semitones, sounds sad. Like, that's cool, but I don't want it to always sound sad. I want it to be happy sometimes. So I then transposed it once more to start all the way down here, which is a major third. So we have a minor third and a major third happening at the same time. So it sounds a little bit happy, a little bit sad. I'm like, awesome. So just those ideas by themselves, I had this from a previous gig, sounds like this. It's nearly a piece, it's getting there, right? But it's not groovy enough. I want it to be more groovy. So I'm going to let you in on a big tip. If you want to make your pieces more rhythmically intricate or groovy, and this is a tip that I learned listening to lots of pop music, so like Stevie Wonder, Michael Jackson, Taylor Swift, Drake, anyone, Bruno Mars, they all do this, right? So if you take a very small idea that is boring on its own, boring short idea, and you repeat it, it's no longer a boring idea, it's now called an ostinato, right? So you get these ostinatos and you pile them on top of each other. So lots of ostinatos happening at the same time on top of each other makes the piece sound really groovy. So I had lots of small little repeating ostinatos on top of each other. So I'll show you what I mean. I had this popping noise, boring on its own, but I put it in. I had this background shimmering sound, boring on its own, but I put it in. And then I had like the baritone effects. So I had this big bass line, on the baritone saxophone. Right, and then I had the backbeat slaps, so big slap tongues on the beats 2 and 4, kind of the bar. Right? And I just put all of those things in, and then basically you put all those ostinatos on top of each other, and you have something that sounds basically like a piece. So you should be able to hear all of those ideas happening basically all the time. All right, let me show you how it works in the next movement though. So I always wanted to play an instrument that plays chords, like a piano or guitar, but unfortunately the saxophone only plays one note at a time. And when we try to play multiple notes at a time, it sounds a little bit like this. So not so pretty, that's called a multiphonic. So I wanted to write a piece that uses multiphonics, but that was pretty. It was a little challenge. So what I did, I had to explore and find lots and lots of different multiphonics, and then I found 2 multiphonics that almost sound like a chord progression next to each other. Have a listen. Okay, so that's the central idea behind this piece, but again, it's not a piece yet. I need to support it somehow. So then I invented the most boring but important motif in all of my compositions, and it goes like this. Okay, it doesn't do much, but it holds the whole piece together. So you'll hear that the whole way through the work, right? And it's kind of like the glue that ties everything together. It provides unity in the work. I could pile all my other motifs on top of that one. And then you'll hear another really important idea in this next one. It goes like this. Kind of boring on its own, but that is kind of like the calling card or the logo of the work. It's scattered throughout the work, and it kind of just reminds the listener that they're still listening to the same work, right? It comes back in different ways, different octaves, but it's like, I think of it as the logo, like so that when it rolls back, everyone goes, oh yeah, there's that idea again, right? The other thing you'll notice in this one, just quickly, is that I can really manipulate the texture of the piece and create contrast by snatching away lots of motifs at the same time. So I'm going to load up this loop station with lots of motifs, lots of recurring ostinatos, and then at different times I'll snatch them all away, and that creates contrast. Like all of a sudden the texture becomes really sparse and makes the piece more interesting, I hope. So this is multi-loops. Thanks. We're running low on time, so I'm just going to shoot through the next one. This next one, I want to try to get all the little movements in today. This next one is called After Silent Loops, right? So what I did with this one is I set myself a challenge. I wanted to write a piece for the loop station that wasn't repetitive. And that's something I really recommend you guys do as composers. It's good to set challenges. Like people out there wrote pieces for one note or just the left hand of the piano. So I wanted to use this but not make repetitive music. So the way this starts is I actually record a few seconds of silence. And I don't know how long that silence is, which means I don't know when the loop is going to come back, which means I can't put anything in time, which means I can't use any ostinatos. So I have no idea really how this piece comes out in the end. So I don't know, you don't know, there's an element of chance. We call that an aleatoric piece. The way it all gets tied together though is, again, with musical motifs. So I have lots of these little calling card ideas. So you'll hear lots of this. And you'll hear lots of this. Okay, and that ties the whole piece together. What this piece really is about, it's about listening to silence. If you're like me, a bit weird, sometimes I like to listen to silence, and you'll notice that silence is really noisy. So you'll be lying in bed and you'll hear, where it should be quiet, you'll hear a car going by, you'll hear the fridge humming, and you'll hear people snoring. And the more you listen to silence, the noisier it gets, right? And that's sort of what happens in this piece. It starts off silently, literally silently, and then it gets really noisy. So this is called After Silent Loops. So this is the last one, guys. This one is called Pocket Loops. So before I go there, I want to say a huge thank you to the Australian Romantic Classical Orchestra for having me along tonight, and for City Recital Hall, and for Daddario Woodwinds who have supported this event. In this one, I try to recreate the sounds of like an old school hip hop track using the extended techniques of the saxophone. So you hear lots of slapping noises, lots of blowing down the neck, lots of key sounds, things that will, like lots of musical motifs that I can pile up to recreate that hip hop sort of feel. Thank you so much.
Wow, that was completely awesome, of course. It's fantastic to have Nick back in City Recital Hall with us, and it's fantastic to have you here with us for live music, for live people. I hope that we will be able to welcome you back for our coming voyages. Thank you very much for coming, and see you next time.